អង្គុយចុះ
President, please be seated.
អង្គជំនះការបន្តកិច្ចដំណើរការ
The chamber is now back in session, and I give the floor to the Defense Counsel to put questions to the expert. You may now proceed, Mr. Vitakope.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Madam Expert. You've heard I've only have very limited time, so let's see if I can cover as many subjects with you as possible. I would like to start with a follow-up question in relation to your PhD. In your PhD, on the very first page, you write that it is in full completion of PhD requirements. You also mentioned David Chandler as your primary advisor. You also talked about him 2 days ago. Was he involved in ultimately acknowledging that all your PhD requirements were met?
To clarify, I started my PhD at another university in New Zealand, completed probably half my study, and then transferred to Monash University. I had 2 supervisors, though Professor Chandler was my primary supervisor. The other was Mariko Vixiani, who was the director of the Monash Asia Institute. So both of them would have had to have made sure everything was in order before my thesis was sent to the committee for the recognition that it was in order, before it was sent overseas to international examiners.
I understand now. I'm not sure what the Australian academic tradition is, but was there at any point in time a necessity for you to defend your methodology toward your promoters, sponsors, or whomever?
Yes, it's a little different than the American system that I went through the first time with the Committee of 5 that you defend your thesis in front of. In the Australian system, you have to defend it in a room with your supervisors and others who are unrelated to your thesis, who are in that room for peer review, and then you do a public presentation. It's an advertised presentation, and people throughout the university in different disciplines come to that presentation. And then, finally, it moves forward to be ready to be sent out for its final review. And in that stage, yes, the methodology is essential to be cleared.
At the very end of everything, has your methodology been accepted in all its entirety?
Yes, it has.
I presume the same with the conclusions that you drew at the end of your research.
Yes, because the international reviewers who read it and marked it and claimed that it was worthy of passing for a degree tracked the methodology as they were tracking the analysis throughout the thesis. That is their role.
I understand, but I just want to have that on record. Is there any discrepancy between what you have said and defended in terms of methodology and conclusions between, on the one hand, your dissertation, and on the other hand, the things that you have been saying here in court for the past 2.5 days? Is there any big contradiction or discrepancy or anything different in your views?
No.
Thank you for this. Let me move to another topic now. I was struck by what you said on the very first day about the issue of marriage. You called it a very heated topic. You talked about the intensity of this topic. You said there was an agenda. You stayed fairly general in this because of time. Would you be able to expand a bit more on what you meant with this?
Yes, during the course of the beginning of my study, there were people that were becoming interested in the topic. Also, people who have actually been in this courtroom before, who had conversations with me, more specifically, Silke Studinsky had exchanges with me, asking me questions about my research. And during that time, when I was offering trends rather than my conclusions, I didn't have conclusions yet when I was in those conversations. There were some meetings, and then there were some email exchanges. And in those email exchanges, what I noted was that there was a tendency to want to convince me of a particular way of looking at the weddings. And in those exchanges, I stood behind my research. I actually have one here, an email. I'll just read just one sentence my side because it's I'll read my email that I sent because I don't have permission from this other person to read their email exchange to me. I received your press. This is dated this was later in the process, 8th of August, 2008. Anthropologists save everything, by the way, as documents. I received your press release and will send a response in the next day or two. I, of course, can only speak from the research study I did over the course of 8 years, but think your 100% claims may be less than consistent with my findings. I could not make an argument against the way you have phrased your claims. I could make an argument against the way you phrase your claims in paragraph 4. If you would like, I can write that. My concerns are so that your argument would hold up, perhaps. There was a trend that I documented regionally, and I wrote about those trends and said, more about my own study. It's an example of the kind of exchanges that I had that then moved me in some ways to go into seclusion with my work. And it's quite easy to see that when I've given interviews in the media at times, if it's an opinion page, there'll be a backlash opinion page. So I do think it is an emotional topic. I think it needs to be an emotional topic. But emotion without reliability may not actually be portraying what happened as it happened.
A very short follow-up question in this regard. Have you read the newspapers this morning?
I have not.
Then don't. Let me move on to my my next subject. That is the issue of a national policy. We've only briefly touched upon the 12 revolutionary principles. and the way or the importance of these principles to the revolutionary cadres or the CPK. Yesterday you were asked a question by the prosecution about what Ing Sari had said in, I believe, 1980. There is, in fact, evidence of Pol Pot also speaking about marriage policy or marriage as such. Are you familiar with what Pol Pot said sometime in August, September 75 to a Belgian delegation?
If you can refresh my memory, please.
Let me read to you what he said. Mr. President, I will be referring to a FIBIS report, E3/76. It's what he said on the 5th of August, 1978. And English ERN, it is 001704226, Khmer 013. 27012, no French translation yet. And this is what he says. On building up a family, the young men and young women build up families on a voluntary basis. After marriage, should problems arise within the family, the masses give advice to the partners in order to sort out their problem. Should the parties concerned find it impossible to cohabit any longer, they have the choice of divorce. Neither of the parties concerned needs to go to court. It goes on a bit further, but were you aware of this excerpt of his interview with the Belgian delegation?
I was.
Now, taking what he says into account, taking also into consideration the revolutionary principles and its importance and its implementation already since the 60s. My question is about logic or common sense of any alleged policy. If it is indeed true that one of DK's objectives was to increase the population, then wouldn't it be illogical and contrary to common sense to force people to marry? Because if you force people to marry, procreation will, per definition or naturally, not come easy, or will be much more difficult. So my question is, isn't the policy as described by Pol Pot in August 78 and as established in the revolutionary principle a logical policy which doesn't entail any forcible nature of weddings?
Firstly, I'm not sure if that's a policy. However, it was a public statement. I mean, it's interesting. I've thought about the revolutionary codes, but I also have thought about the gender codes of conduct. I know primarily in the courts the female roles of conduct have been presented, but I there's a PhD student who finished his PhD in February 2014, Sat Sok, at Victoria University in Melbourne, and he did his PhD thesis on the topic of that included, among other things, the male gender codes of conduct. And those gender male codes, and when I look at the female ones as well, a lot of those run right through some of the revolutionary principles, especially about warning against adultery. So what I can say at this moment is what Pol Pot had said then would align with a potential policy to have people in exclusive relationships first before one thinks about consummation of that relationship. I'd have to ponder more your question about the logic.
That I understand that. Let me move on to another topic which was discussed extensively the last days, and that is a climate of fear or sort of a general climate of coercion. Would you agree with me that the existence, if at all, existence of a climate of fear or a lack thereof in the daily lives of the men and women you interviewed depended on the approach of the local authorities, people like the village chiefs, etc. It was they who were by far the most responsible for any climate of fear. Would you agree with me on this?
I would object is clearly beyond the witness's expertise. She's never claimed to know anything about security centers, arrests, the structure of the leadership of the Democratic Kampuchea.
Perhaps a more open question would be more appropriate. Do you feel confident to tell us what you think was the reason or who was responsible in the wider sense, not necessarily legally, for this climate of fear, or does this go beyond the scope of your study? You told us there was this climate of fear. That's how I understood you. Would you feel comfortable as an expert? And don't, you have occasionally said, and we are grateful for that, I don't know, I'm assuming now. So I think what we want to know is, do you know something about that? Do you feel comfortable to say this climate of fear, coercion was brought about by